Hello everyone, and welcome to Fresh Catholic Teaching Courses. This is series number 6, and we're going to do the topic, the virtues. And as I mentioned in kind of the teaser or the promo for this series, when you hear the word or the phrase, the virtues, if you're like most Catholics, you think, well, okay, I've heard the term, I've heard the phrase, but I'm not quite sure what they are or what they do for me or how I get them or what they're called or how many of them there are. And if you're like one of us Catholics that have some of those questions, this series is for you because we're going to do a series on the virtues, and this being the first episode in this series, it'll be our typical first episode in a series episode, in that we'll go up to 30,000 feet, get a general sense of our topic just overall, lay down some foundational information, some basic principles, just to get us up and running, get us some traction, get us some direction. And then beginning next episode on, we'll take a look at each of the 7 main virtues. And if you're saying, that's interesting already, Charles, 7 main virtues. There's 3 theological and 4 moral, and we'll get to those later. But 7, and we have already established, number 7 has a very, very significant biblical significance in that it stands for perfection and completeness. God rested on the 7th day because creation was perfect and complete. We have 7 sacraments, and there are 7 main virtues. So see, you're learning something already. But at any rate, this first episode, 30,000 feet, get a general sense of the topic, lay down some foundation, some basic principles from which we'll build on as we go through each of these 7 main virtues beginning next episode. So let's start with this. Let's say that I wanted to pursue, on a natural level, I wanted to pursue an activity to the highest level I could. Well, in order to pursue an activity to the highest level I can, I basically need 2 things. I need the skills and abilities that activity requires, and kind of beyond that, I need what's called a stable disposition to practice those skills and abilities from the heart with intensity. And when we say a stable disposition, stable in that it's consistent. It doesn't come and go. Disposition, meaning it's not an individual act as much as it is a part of me. So let me give you an example. Suppose I want to pursue basketball. I want to be the best basketball player I can possibly be. Well, I need those 2 things, don't I? I need the skills and abilities that basketball requires, first things first, right? But then beyond that, I need that stable disposition to practice those skills and abilities from the heart, not just go through the motions. I need to practice them from the heart, intensely, consistently. So if I have those 2 things, that'll enable me to pursue this activity, basketball in our case, to the highest level I can. So that's we're talking about the natural realm, the natural level. Does that now transfer to the spiritual level? It does, because if I want to pursue holiness, if I want to pursue a moral life, a virtuous life to the highest level possible, which I should, I need those same 2 kind of things. Rather than skills and abilities, what I need is to be able to engage in the correct moral behaviors. And beyond that, I need to engage in them consistently and from the heart. I have to have a stable disposition to engage in those morally good and correct behaviors. So whether you're talking about natural basketball or the spiritual life, the moral life, the virtuous life, both of them require basically 2 things. Naturally, I need skills and abilities. Spiritually, I need to perform morally good actions. Naturally, I need a stable disposition to practice those skills and abilities. Spiritually, I need a stable disposition to engage in those morally good behaviors. Now, I say this and I make this comparison because that begs the question, okay, if I am going to pursue the spiritual life, if I'm going to pursue holiness, moral life, a virtuous life to the highest level I can, and if I need to engage in moral behaviors, and I need a stable disposition to engage in them all the time, what enables me to do that? And that's the topic at hand. The virtues give me the stable disposition I need to engage in the correct moral behaviors consistently and from the heart in order to pursue holiness and morality and virtue to the highest level I can. So right off the bat, we get a sense of how significant, how critical, how important a role the virtues play in the pursuit of holiness, in the living out of a moral and a virtuous life, because they are those stable dispositions that enable me to do what's necessary to live a moral life, a virtuous life, and pursue holiness. So virtues, right off the bat, the first thing we want to kind of, first brick in our foundation is how critical, how significant, how big a part they play in the Christian life, in being a disciple of Christ. Now, the other thing we want to consider is when we're talking about the moral life, when we're talking about morality, we don't want to think of it in kind of like a box checking thing. Okay, in order to live the moral life, in order to be moral, in order to conduct myself in a moral way, I've got to check off these boxes. Properly understood, morality is the seeking and attaining of what is good. Now, let's kind of see if we can wrap our minds around that. The seeking and the attaining of what is good. Now, as humans, we're naturally inclined to seek and attain what's good. But the rub is, what do we perceive as good, and why do we perceive it that way? Well, virtues have a huge role in this as well, because in order to pursue holiness, to lead a moral and virtuous life, not only do we have to have within us the stable disposition to engage in morally good acts all the time, we also have to operate, we have to live in what's called an ordered way. Now, when we say when we want to live in an ordered way, what does that mean? What that means is our lower faculties, those are our desires, our emotions, and our passions, our lower faculties have to be subject to our higher faculties, our intellect and will, and in turn, our higher faculties have to be subject to God. So lower faculties subject to higher, higher subject to God. Or put another way, desires, emotions, passions subject to our intellect and our intellect and our will subject to God. That's the correct order. God, then our intellect and our will, then our emotions, desires, and passions. That's the correct order. Now, why is that important? Because it's important in terms of just the nature of how we operate. Let me give you an example, okay? Anytime anything is presented to us, a thing is presented to us. Now, what happens is a thing is presented to our intellect. Our intellect, if it perceives it as good, will then inform the will. Hey, will, this is good, go after it. The will then activate our desires and our emotions and our passions to go after it intensely. Now, give you another example. Something is given to us, right? It's presented to us. Our intellect perceives it as bad or evil. It then informs the will. Hey, will, this is bad or evil, avoid it. And then the will activates the emotions and the passions and the desires to avoid it intensely. That's how we're created. That's how we're designed to operate. A thing is presented to the intellect informs the will about it, and depending on what the intellect informs the will either pursues it or avoids it. That's operating in an ordered fashion. Now, what the virtues allow us to do is when a thing is presented to our intellect, rather than the intellect determining for itself whether it's good or bad and informing the will, what the virtues enables us to do is when a thing is presented to the intellect, the first thing the intellect does is it goes to God. And in essence, it says, hey, God, this thing, is it good or is it evil? Now, if God tells the intellect it's good, then the intellect tells the will, this is good, pursue it, and the will activates the emotions and passions to pursue it intensely. The intellect goes to God, says, is this good or evil? And if God says it's evil, then the intellect informs the will it's evil. The will avoids it and activates the emotions and passions to avoid it intensely. So the virtues enable our intellect, okay, to get informed of the goodness or the evilness of the thing by first going to God. Because God is the ultimate determiner of what is good or what is evil. So, the virtues, summarizing here, the virtues help us pursue holiness, lead moral and virtuous lives, A, by giving us that stable disposition to engage in morally good acts consistently and from the heart. And two, they enable us to operate in an ordered fashion, okay? God informs the intellect then informs the will, and depending on what the intellect says, the will either pursues it or avoids it, depending on what God indicates. So the virtues in leading that moral life, that virtuous life, in pursuing holiness, they play a huge part in that. They're very critical and very significant, yet, as I mentioned in the teaser and in the front end of this episode, a lot of us really don't know, first of all, what they are, what they do, how they do it, how we even get them, and what are the different types. So it seemed to us that critical and important and significant as they are in our pursuit of holiness and in leading moral and virtuous lives, it'd be good to do a series on exactly what these are, how they operate, so that we can be more aware of them and we can tap into them more readily and more deeply. Because the problem is that the culture, Satan through the culture, what he's trying to get us to do is operate not in an ordered fashion, but operate in a disordered fashion. What he's trying to do is either bypass our intellect right off the bat and go right to our will and say, look, I'm going to present something to you. Don't bother thinking about whether it's good or bad. Just do it, right? So one of the things is to try and bypass the intellect and go straight to the will and your emotions and have you act on something before you go to God to determine whether you should or you shouldn't. The other thing that happens is that our culture reverses it. It presents evil as good and good as evil. And, oftentimes that's confusing, it's very deceptive, because again, we're operating in this world with what's called, after original sin, with what's called a fallen human nature. And what a fallen human nature consists of is our intellect is cloudy. It doesn't see things as clearly as it should. Our wills are weakened. They don't resist things as strongly as they should. So we're operating in this world with an intellect that's clouded and a will that's weakened. We're already kind of at a disadvantage, if you will, because when the culture presents us with something as good that's really evil, the reason we don't see it sometimes for what it is Because our intellect doesn't see things as it should, because it's clouded by virtue of the original sin. And our wills can't resist it because they're weakened. Now, even though original sin was taken away in baptism, true, we're still left, nonetheless, with the fallen human nature that resulted from it. And like we just said, that fallen human nature includes a cloudy intellect and a weakened will. So we need grace. We need the grace from God to be able to kind of overcome this. And the virtues give us the grace to be able to do that. Because God gives us His grace, yes, primarily through the sacraments. But that's not the only channels of grace. We get grace primarily through the sacraments. We also get grace through the gifts of the Holy Spirit. We get grace through prayer. And we get grace through the virtues. And the grace we get from the virtues help us to have that stable disposition, help us to act in an ordered fashion, so that we can seek and attain the good and avoid the evil, and see them as they are, to see good as good and evil as evil, and not mix them up or be deceived as the culture is trying to do to us. So again, this topic, very significant, very critical, very important to the leading of the moral life. Now, let's see if we can hang a couple of examples on that, okay? Let's go with, let's try this. Let's say something is presented, and I'll use myself as an example, okay? Something is presented to Charles Merritt. It's presented as good, but it's really evil. Now, how do I make sure that I'm not deceived by that? All right? Well, rather than doing what the culture says and basically says, trust me, if I say it's good, and if it's good, go after it, right? Rather than me trusting the culture, what the virtues help me do is trust God. Is to say, okay, culture, I know what you're saying, okay? I know you're telling me this is good and that my will should go after it with gusto, with intensity. I get it. I know what you're telling me. But time out, hold on. Let me consult God first, because God is the determiner and the arbiter between good and evil. I know what you're telling me, culture. I know you're telling me this is good, but hold on right there. Let me go to God. God, is this good? If God, through His revelation, His word, His church, tells me it's good, then I say, okay, culture, it actually is good. I'm going to go ahead and inform my will as such. My will go ahead and pursue it with intensity. Okay? However, if I go to God and God says, no, it's evil, all right, then I'm going to say, okay, culture, you're telling me it's good. God is telling me it's evil. I trust God, so I'm going to inform my will. It's evil, even though you're telling me it's good, it's evil, and since it's evil, will avoid it with intensity. That's the way I should operate, and the virtues enable me to do that, because that's operating in an ordered fashion. And the virtues, being stable dispositions, enable me to operate that way all the time. Not when it's easy, not when I feel like it, not when it's convenient, all the time, because virtues are stable dispositions. So they enable me to operate in an ordered fashion as part of who I am, as part of how I operate. Think of stable dispositions as part of being in my spiritual DNA. That's how I'm spiritually wired. Let me give you a story that may kind of flesh this out a little bit more. There's an owner of a convenience store, and let's say two teenagers come in, and they're browsing around the store, and the owner's kind of not paying too much attention, And then the two teenagers leave. And after they leave, the store owner discovers a ton of merchandise has been stolen. So he calls the police. The police track the teenagers down. They drag them back into the store. And the two teenagers are standing in front of the store owner. And the store owner asks teenager number one, "Did you steal that merchandise?" And teenager number one says this. He says, "I did not steal that merchandise this time." He then turns to teenager two, same question. "Did you steal that merchandise?" Teenager two says, "I don't steal." Now let's compare their two responses, because one is indicative of a stable disposition, the other is indicative of a particular action at a particular time. Teenager number one, "I did not steal that candy." Teenager two, "I don't steal, period." Teenager two, his response is an example of a stable disposition, because he's telling the store owner, "I'm not a thief. I don't steal things, period. That's not who I am. That's not what I'm about. So since I fundamentally am not a thief, I didn't steal your candy this time." That's a stable disposition. And the virtues are stable dispositions that enable us to seek and attain the good and avoid the evil in an ordered fashion all the time, because of who and what we are, because it's part of us. It's not individual acts that we manufacture in individual situations. It's part of our DNA. It's how we're wired spiritually. It's who we are. So who we are pursues the good and avoids the evil all the time, because it's part and parcel of us. What enables us to get to that level, so to speak? The virtues. And so if we're talking pursuing holiness, which we should, if we're talking about leading moral and virtuous lives, which we should, a key component in that are these virtues. Now, we mentioned there's 7 of them. They're divided into 2 categories. You've got what are called the theological virtues, and what you've got what are called the moral or the cardinal virtues. Now, in the theological virtues, you've got faith, hope, and love or charity. So 3 theological. The moral virtues, you've got prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. So again, theological, faith, hope, and love. Moral or cardinal, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. And by the way, when we say moral or cardinal, what the word cardinal actually means is hinge. So the moral virtues, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, they act like hinges that help swing us, if you will, to morally good acts and swing us away from morally bad acts. Just like a hinge on a door allows it to open and shut, these hinge virtues, these moral virtues, these cardinal virtues, help us swing towards the morally good and swing away from the morally bad or evil. So, with that, one other thing we should make mention is that ultimately, all of these virtues come through the grace of God. The theological virtues are infused in us directly. The moral virtues, we perfect by practicing them, but we perfect them through that practice with the grace of God. So both theological and moral come ultimately from God. Theological, you might say, come directly from God. They're directly infused in us by God. The moral virtues come to us true by us practicing them, But what perfects our practice of them is grace, and grace ultimately comes from God. Now, the other thing we should mention, because we're laying bricks in our foundation, is that the theological virtues have God as their object and their end, whereas the moral virtues have God as their end, yes, but they have created things as their object. Let me say it again. The theological virtues have God as their object and their end. The moral virtues have created things as their object, but God as their end, because the moral virtues they're meant to determine our use of created goods. So, ultimately, let me just say this, ultimately, all of our human actions at the end of the day should go toward glorifying, honoring, praising, and thanking God. Every single human action we do, whether that action is a spoken word or whether it's an activity, it's a deed, should honor, glorify, praise, and thank God. Now, part of us being able to do that is how we use His created goods. Do we use them in the manner He designed them to be used, or do we misuse them or abuse them? Okay, let's hang an example on that. Let's say eating, for example. Okay, food is a created good. All right, we should consume that food in a responsible manner. Okay, we shouldn't undereat and become anorexic, because that compromises our health. We shouldn't overeat because that compromises our health. So we want to use this created good food in a responsible way so as to protect the health that God has given us, rather than misuse it one way or another and compromise that health. Well, what enables us to use this created good of food in a responsible way, to maintain and not compromise our health? What enables us to do that? That is one of the moral virtues, temperance. So temperance, the moral virtue, enables us to use a created good the way God designed it to be used, and therefore, since I'm using His created goods according to how He designed them to be used, I am honoring and glorifying and praising and thanking God. So, I can honor, glorify, praise, and thank God directly through the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, or I can do those things kind of indirectly through the proper use of the created goods He's given us. So whether it's direct or whether it's kind of indirect through His created goods, the virtues enable us to do that. They enable us to perform actions that honor, glorify, praise, and thank God consistently with joy and intensity, because it's coming from kind of like our spiritual DNA, our spiritual wiring, so to speak. So as we conclude this first episode, what we've done is we've gone up to 30,000 feet, as we say, and we've gotten a sense of what the virtues in general enable us to do as far as pursuing holiness, leading moral and virtuous lives. B, how critical, significant, and important they are in doing that. And C, we've kind of listed out the two categories and the individual virtues within both of those categories, and how each in their own way ultimately enable us to honor, glorify, praise, and thank God in a consistent, stable way because they're part of our inner dispositions, our spiritual DNA, our spiritual wiring. So those are the virtues in general. The rest of the episodes we do in this series, and we'll start with the theological virtues first and then go to the moral ones. What we'll do is we'll examine how each of the individual virtues do what we said virtues in general do, but how each of them do it in their own specific way. So that's what lies ahead. So with that, as always, as I wrap up this episode, thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. Thank you for supporting the 5 previous theology series and hopefully supporting this one as you keep tuning in. And until episode number 2, when we take a look at the first of those theological virtues, faith, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.